You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
Imagine if the money you've saved over many years, which was worth the price of a car, suddenly only had enough left to buy a motorbike. And now, imagine what your life would be like if that situation continued for many years. That was the context of Vietnam during the period 1986-1989. Faced with the devastating impact of hyperinflation, what did the then chairman of the Council of Ministers do Muoi do to overcome the difficulties? To 1986, Vietnam experienced a unique historical period known as the centrally planned economy era, when the private sector was abolished, giving way to the collective and state-owned economic sectors. During this period, most economic activities were not exchanged for money, but were distributed by the state through a rationing system using coupons. Workers would use their ration coupons to exchange for almost any kind of goods, from salt and sugar to cloth, soap, and thermos flasks. This is a model that Vietnam adopted from the Soviet Union, aiming to eliminate the gap between rich and poor and create equal development opportunities for everyone. However, it has a major drawback. When everyone is paid the same, the subsidized system will fail to create motivation, leading to a sharp decline in labor productivity. Vietnam's GDP grew by only 4% per year the period 1977. More seriously, that figure fell by nearly 279 in 1980, leaving Vietnam's GDP per capita among the lowest in the world at that time. At that time, Vietnam was still under a US embargo and had not yet normalized relations with China. Therefore, the government had to constantly borrow from foreign countries and receive aid from the Soviet Union. By 1985, foreign debt amounted to 5 billion rubles and 9. The lives of millions of Vietnamese people have become extremely difficult amidst a stagnant economy, sluggish production, shortages of goods, and a lack of free market circulation. Given this situation, change is inevitable. In 1985, the 8th plenum of the 5th Central Committee took place and officially raised the issue of a comprehensive adjustment of prices, wages, and currency. The goal of the reforms was to transition to a market economy, eliminating the centralized, bureaucratic, and subsidized system. Regarding pricing, the state calculates the prices of all goods in full, closely reflecting production costs and actual market prices. For convenience, all prices were converted to rice, with an average of $25. However, some important input materials such as gasoline, oil, cement, iron, and steel had fixed prices, more than 10 times higher than the old prices. Regarding wage, instead of receiving ration coupons as before, workers are now paid in cash with a 20% increase. Regarding money, to meet the new prices and wages, more money must be printed, bringing the total amount in circulation to 120 billion dong. However, at that time, Vietnam could not print its own money and had to rely on foreign countries to do so, which made the process impractical. Therefore, instead of printing money, the government implemented a currency reform policy, with 1 new dong being exchanged for 10 current dong. At that time, just 12 billion VND of newly printed currency, when exchanged, would be equivalent to 120 billion VND in current value. The purpose of currency reform is to reduce the amount of money in circulation, thereby increasing its value. However, what happened afterward painted a rather bleak picture. Every aspect of the reform failed. Firstly, regarding state-owned enterprises could not withstand a tenfold increase in prices and proposed reducing material prices by about 70%, which was approved by the government. Secondly, regarding wages, The slow pace of production leads to shortages of goods, which in turn drives up prices and puts pressure on wages to continue increasing. The initial 20% salary increase could no longer keep pace with rising prices, so the government had to raise salaries by 100%, depleting the budget and forcing the printing of more money. Thirdly, regarding money, since the new currency is worth less than 10 times the old currency, while the new prices of some supplies have increased by approximately 10 times the old prices, the amount of money issued must increase rapidly to meet the needs of paying salaries, purchasing goods at the new prices, and covering the state budget deficit. By the end of night, the amount of money in circulation had increased by 150% compared to the previous year. All of these factors created a vicious cycle, causing inflation to continuously rise, reaching 73 cents in 1985 and exploding to triple digits in 1986, 1980, and 1988. During the day, inflation in African and European countries was also in double digits. In Asia, only a few countries like Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand have inflation below 10%, with record high inflation in 1980, meaning inflation was over 60% every month. While bank deposit interest rates were only around 2-3% per month, people didn't want to hold on to their money for long because of the rapid rate of devaluation. As soon as the sales were over, people rushed to buy goods, gold, or under that pressure, the state implemented a policy of freezing prices, requiring each commodity to have a price tag and forcing people to buy and sell in the free market at those imposed prices. However, this tight control became counterproductive, as people could trade at much higher negotiated prices, causing the free market to slip out of the state's control and dragging the state down with it. Faced with that enormous challenge, what did Vietnam do? Truong Chanh was appointed General Secretary, succeeding the recently deceased Le Don. At the time of taking office, the political report to be presented at the 6th Party Congress, scheduled to take place at the end of the year, had already been sent down to party congresses at all levels. However, realizing that the content did not adequately reflect the current situation, the late General Secretary Truong Chanh decided to rewrite the political report, adding content on economic reform. Then, when the 6th Party Congress took place, he recognized the seriousness of the country's situation at that time. He and the country's leadership team decided to change course to completely reform the economy. However, when Mr. Muoi became chairman of the Council of Ministers in June 1988, inflation was still very high. Inflation was still at 9% a month, and if the trend continued, it would reach 100% a year. Prices, especially gold, surged in the first quarter, increasing 2 times compared to the beginning of 1988. In addition, smuggling and surplus goods also emerged even amidst inflation. The more people work and produce, the more losses they incur. Savings deposited in 1987 and 1988 would lose significant value if both principal and interest were withdrawn after 1 year. Therefore, people in those years often joked among themselves, "Sell a buffalo to buy a chicken," meaning that if someone sold a buffalo and deposited the money in a bank, after a year, when they withdrew the principal and interest, it would only be enough to buy 1 chicken. All of this paints a chaotic picture, as the Vietnamese economy struggles to navigate the inertia of the old centrally planned economy, while simultaneously embracing a newly formed market economy, which lacks precedent and a sufficiently developed legal framework. In response to this situation, seminars on combating inflation, with the participation of financial and banking experts, began. 1989 also marked the first time the term inflation was used in macroeconomic analysis in Vietnam. Some domestic economic experts have proposed issuing heavy currency, backed by gold, to gradually replace the current depreciating currency. Others propose the theory of fighting fire with fire, that is, using inflation itself to combat inflation. Some foreign organizations have even offered to lend Viet Nam $2 billion to halt this inflationary trend. After listening to the presentations, Muoi did not approve of any of the proposals, because they all fought inflation on the basis of a centrally planned and subsidized economy and went against the interests of the people. If implemented, people could lose all the money they currently hold and would certainly protest. After a meticulous selection process, Muoi chose 4 proposals to form the basis for the then current plan to combat hyperinflation. The selected projects came from the Institute of World Economics under the Vietnam National Committee for Social Sciences, the Faculty of Economic Management at the Nguyen A Quoc National Political Academy, the Central Economic Committee, and the National Economics University in Hanoi. Although not selected, MP still filtered the recommendations of other organizations or individuals to select the reasonable elements. Immediately, MP directed the establishment of a task force to develop the anti-inflation plan of the chairman of the Council of Ministers, comprising more than 10 members, most notably Professor V.A.P.I.L.C. from the Institute of World Economics. Da Swan Sam is from the Department of Economic Management at the National Political Academy, and Mr. Le, who was then Muoi's assistant. The anti-inflation plan was quickly completed by the task force, featuring numerous solutions and focusing on addressing many issues believed to directly contribute to inflation. First, there is the issue of imbalances in the supply and demand of goods. To solve this problem, Muoi directed that every effort be made to boost domestic production of goods in order to create a solid supply of goods. The purpose of this action is to respond to potential fluctuations in the supply and demand of goods that may occur when drastic anti-inflationary measures are subsequently implemented. Besides boosting production, MP also requested the Ministry of Foreign Trade to abolish unreasonable regulations on non-commercial imports, and to refrain from taxing or purchasing goods brought back from abroad by officials, experts, students, and overseas Vietnamese. This encouraged them to bring back as much merchandise as possible. Secondly, there are difficulties related to import and export and foreign exchange. 9. Vietnam had a multi-exchange rate system, which included a black market exchange rate called the non-trade exchange rate, a state fixed exchange rate called the trade exchange rate, used for payments with the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, and the internal accounting exchange rate, which is not publicly disclosed, is calculated based on the trade exchange rate to compensate for losses in import and export activities of state-owned companies. This exchange rate mechanism has hampered export activities and stifled the development of businesses. Vietnam officially ended the multiple exchange rate regime by adjusting the official exchange rate based on market signals, and allowing the free market exchange rate to fluctuate within a 5% limit of the official exchange rate. This change boosted exports, increased the supply of foreign currency, and thus helped reduce the deficit in the trade balance and the balance of payments. Thirdly, there is the bottleneck of budget overspending. Muoi issued several directives, such as ceasing the use of the state budget to subsidize exports and compensate for import losses. Encourage overseas Vietnamese to send remittances back to the country. The banking system was reorganized to include the State Bank of Vietnam, which functions as a regulatory body, and specialized banks operating with capital raised from the public. Fourth, there is the situation of negative real interest rates. To address this difficulty, the government has shifted to positive real interest rates. However, MP strongly supported this policy, repeatedly stating, "The price of goods and the price of money are like a boat and water. They must always be linked. When the boat rises, the water rises. When the boat falls, the water falls. The boat cannot be high while the water is low." Because inflation in January and February 1988 was 8% per month, the proposal suggested raising interest rates on demand deposits to 9% per month, and on 3-month term deposits to 12% per month. Although these rates were high, they were only just enough to offset the inflation at the time. When real interest rates became positive, meaning higher than inflation, the problem of holding cash, like holding a hot coal, was finally resolved. At that point, people no longer hoarded goods but preferred to deposit money in banks, thus cooling down price increases because goods were no longer scarce. Banks also mobilized more deposits, thus curbing the printing of money when there was a shortage of loans. Furthermore, the prices of all consumer goods and materials were raised to near market prices. Wages were adjusted upwards, not only offsetting the impact of rising prices but also contributing to improving people's lives. The minimum wage was raised fourfold, inflation increased fivefold, and the total wage fund increased fivefold compared to 1988, despite the drastic measures. Muoi remained very cautious in their implementation. He sent a delegation of officials, including the Director General of the State Bank, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Trade, and the Chairman of the State Planning Committee, to Haiphong for a pilot program. After this process, it was observed that the implementation of these measures did not cause socio-economic disruption. Based on, he proposed to the Council of Ministers the application of the anti-inflation plan nationwide, by implementing many innovative solutions simultaneously. Chairman of the Council of Ministers Muoi successfully halted hyperinflation. From 3-digit levels in 1986-1988, inflation fell below 40% in 1989 and even only 10% in 1992. Goods, which were once scarce, became abundant. Viet Nam planned to import goods. In 1989, 200,000 tons of food were barely enough to feed the entire country. However, the result was that imports were avoided, and there was even a surplus for export, thanks to reserves of approximately 500,000 tons and sufficient foreign currency to import another 500,000 if needed. This was a miraculous turnaround for a nation facing famine, transforming it into a rice exporter. Furthermore, the bank mobilized approximately 1 trillion dong in deposits from the public within 3 months for lending, while the plan projected only around 300 billion dong. The United Nations described Vietnam's anti-inflation efforts at the time as extraordinarily successful. However, this achievement came at a very high price. In a short period, more than half of state-owned enterprises went bankrupt, resulting in approximately 600,000 workers losing their jobs and having to rely on subsidies to make ends meet. Following this, Muoi and many other leaders made significant adjustments. The initial plan for combating inflation was defined. Later, at the 7th National Congress, Chairman of the Council of Ministers Muoi became General Secretary. This was also the period of Vietnam's best economic development and growth, thanks to improved production capacity and investment efficiency. Furthermore, this period witnessed the introduction of many new policies, such as the law on companies, the law on private enterprises, the law on revenue tax, and the recognition of the private sector in the 1992 Constitution. These factors marked important milestones in changing the fundamental institutional framework towards a market economy. Amidst the numerous difficulties brought about by hyperinflation, Muoi chose the most decisive path, accepting short-term sacrifices to help the Vietnamese economy gradually recover and regain its growth momentum, aiming for stronger development in the future.